Hello, I'm Alfie and welcome to Culture of Coal, Wakefield Stories. David Peace now lives in Tokyo, but his writing is deeply rooted in his experiences growing up in the Wakefield area during the late 20th century. His writing has covered diverse areas, from the miners' strike and working class football culture to thrillers set in post-war Japan. He joins me today to discuss how his upbringing in Ossett has helped to inspire his award-winning novels. Hi David, you were born and brought up in Ossett, but
Mm.
how did this upbringing influence your writing on Yorkshire?
Well, I was actually born in Dewsbury, and actually grew up. First of all, I grew up in Denby Dale and moved to Ossett when I was about 5, but then lived in Ossett all the time then until I went to Manchester Poly. So I was there, and I think I know it's a kind of cliche which you're told when you start writing, but it's to write about what you know. And I was born in '67 and left like Ossett, Dewsbury, Wakefield area in '86. And so that period that my first few books are about, and my first 6 books are all about really that period, which was the time of the time of the Yorkshire Ripper. And those first 4 books, the Red Riding books, were really an attempt to understand why that case happened in Yorkshire. Was there something about the society that made it kind of culpable? I suppose it was really more. It was because everybody knows who did it. It was more about the effect it had on the communities. Really, the books were about the effect it had on everybody who lived through it. And then the last of that quartet is 1983, which is set during the Thatcher's second election victory. And initially, the plan had been to write. I'd actually thought that I would write the last of the books would be set during the strike. But as I was writing the Red Riding Quartet, I realised I couldn't kind of just tack on the miners' strike onto something that's. There is an overlap in the policing, obviously, and some characters and so forth, and actually there are certain overlaps then with later events. Like if you go on to Hillsborough and things, there's certain things that overlap these incidents. But I realised that I'd always wanted to write a book about the strike because it had been something that I'd lived through. Basically in Ossett, but also the strike. 84, 85, I was doing my A levels at Wakefield Wakefield District College, and that was at the centre of many mining communities and many of the people, and there was my own family connections and the friends and so forth. And it was the Yorkshire Ripper and the miners' strike were the 2 kind of pivotal events in the time I was growing up. And I mean, like in a kind of much more trivial way, that the 6th book, The Damned United, was about Brian Clough at Elland Road, which is triggered from my dad taking me to see Huddersfield Town for the first time when Brian Clough brought the Leeds team. So all those 6 books are connected to me growing up in the Dewsbury Wakefield area, and I wouldn't have written them if I'd not been born and raised there. So yeah, essential.
And you've spoken before, like you mentioned then a little bit about your memories of the miners' strike in 1984, and I believe you were in a band at the time, so I've read. But can you tell me a little bit about how this influenced GB84 and sort of your memories of that period?
Well, yeah, so the strike. So I was doing. So I was at, as I say, I was at Wakefield District College. I was doing my A levels, and I was doing like English, history, and government and politics. And I was also in a band, which I'd met most of the members of the band while I was at the district college. And I came from a left wing family. Like my great uncles had been miners in the Thornhill area. Most people had either relatives. They either had people in the distant past, like myself, or like in the who were actually, or like family members who were in the pits, or some job connected with the mining community. So when the strike began in March, it seems funny to people outside of the area, but nobody I knew was against the strike. Everybody was for the strike. Sometimes you'd hear, particularly a bit later on, about the wisdom of the timing of the strike and things like that. But nobody was. And so I can remember, sorry, because I'm going to these memories will all be out of sync and things. But I remember, because we were we were quite like, we used to go down to the Red Shed, the Wakefield Labour Club, quite a bit, and like they would organise buses down to demonstrations in London and so forth. And if I'm really honest, we would go down, we'd go on the demonstration, but also it was a chance to go to London quite cheaply as well. To be honest. And I mean, I was amazed that, like, that people that watching the news and stuff. I was amazed that people were against us, sort of, like, I suppose naively a bit, sort of, you just assumed that people all support the strike, and when it first started, there was a kind of, and again, this says a lot, maybe more about my personal situation than anything else. But the band, for example, we got kind of more gigs, and there were like, there was a kind of, because there was like support the miners gigs, and there were a lot of like, music was actually quite a political thing in those days. There were like bands like the Redskins and Free Johns, and in the Leeds area, in the West Yorkshire area, and there were a lot of people like Billy Bragg and Paul Weller, who was then in like the Style Council, the Jam had finished the Style Council and so forth. There were a lot of Chumbawamba. There were a lot of people doing like pro miners kind of benefits and so forth. And so it was, in a way, it was a sort of exciting kind of time in a way, really. And there was a sense that you were taking on what was seen in Wakefield as a deeply unpopular government. I think that changed really with Orgreave, to be honest. And then as winter dragged on, and it was just really obvious. I mean, Orgreave, I think, was shocking in the way that it really, you just realise that like the whole state apparatus, the media and so forth, were rained against you and were prepared to do anything and lie and batter you, and they would kill people if that was, it didn't seem, it seemed that would, they wouldn't stop at anything to defeat the miners. And and then there's, I mean, and then you get into the autumn, and there's the Brighton bomb, and the like Thatcher drawing the parallels between like the IRA and the miners as the enemy within, and the obvious hope that like winter would see the stocks would have been diminished and so forth, and the strike would start to bite, and it didn't, and so forth, and so when you get to the winter, really, my memories, and you started to see like obviously people in Wakefield had started to go back, and you'd see. And I saw like in a couple of pubs on 2 or 3 occasions, like really, really vicious kind of like, I mean, at the time it seemed like almost like Wild West type kind of barroom kind of brawls, but really vicious kind of fighting between, striking and non-striking miners. And so really, once you got into the January, you were just kind of praying it would really end, really. And I think, and so, and also you saw like, like at Wakefield District College, the people, I mean, people were, I mean, you saw like the effect. I mean, you gave as much as you gave as much as you could. I mean, my dad was a junior school head teacher in Ossett, and he gained some like local notoriety because they had a harvest festival at the school. Like I don't know if they still did it when you were a kid, but they bring in tins and things, and you're supposed to give them to old people, or I don't know who you're supposed to give them to. But my dad gave them to striking miners' families, and he was like, his name was Basil, so he was like, but when the press got hold of it, and it was like Red Basil, it was like, and it was like got into all kinds of trouble over it and stuff. But it was like, because the friends of mine who were from striking families, it became this thing about crisp sandwiches became the thing. Like all they could eat was like crisp sandwiches. People are proud. You don't want like just like your charity. It just became a really, like as I say, the kind of early kind of excitement and the feeling that possibly you could like win not only the victory for the miners, but also to bring down the government. That kind of like went away. And I think the defeat, and I say this with shame, I think the defeat really kind of like for a few years after left me, and I think quite a lot of people I knew, in a very kind of apolitical kind of like in a kind of like almost like turning your back on politics and to wanting to forget about the whole thing. And so when I started to write, this was a story I wanted to write about, and when I came to write about it, and I've said this before, but I mean, I wrote it in out of a mixture of guilt and shame, really, and anger, really, because I'd been there in the centre of one of the mining areas, and I'd and I had worn my coal not dole badge, gone on the demos and done the gigs, and always felt that support of the miners. But I don't think I had any idea of really the suffering and sacrifice that people were actually going through. That kind of, and actually the more I then read and things that you sort of, I mean, you kind of had a sense of like, because you were forever being, you were forever being like, if I'd go anywhere with my dad, like to football matches or anything, whenever you try to leave, you were always being stopped and asked where you were going and this kind of thing. So you had a sense of the state apparatus that was raimed against you, but only when I was doing the research into GB84 did I ever comprehend exactly the extent to which it was like true and it wasn't conspiracy theories and so forth. And so, GB84, as I say, was like this mixture of like anger that I'd been so kind of naive and stupid, and also guilt, really, that like it was just like in a way I just feel now it was just lip service, really.
And how did you do your research for GB84 and also for the Red Riding Quartet? And did you speak to people within Ossett, Dewsbury, Wakefield, that were the people you knew that you spoke to?
So all the books I've written, all the books I've published have been written while I've been living in Japan. So with with the Red Riding Quartet, that was really done through that was really done through more like friends and family, really, like not really particularly recent. That was more to do with like memories and also local newspapers, which again was really key for GB84, the newspapers. But with GB84, what happened was actually, so the Red Riding Quartet had been published by Serpent's Tail, but GB84 was published by Faber. So I'd gone to Faber, and actually I'd gone to Faber on a 2-book contract. And the book I was supposed to write first was a book called The Yorkshire Rippers, plural, which is going to be a different way of writing about the Yorkshire Rippers. And that was going to be the book. But when I went to meet them and came and met John Riley, who was the editor at Faber, who, like, if you like, bought me from Serpent's Tail, I hadn't met him personally. And so I came on holiday from Japan with like my kids, and I went down to London to meet him just for lunch. And we talked about Yorkshire Rippers, and then he said, "And this, what's the other book you're going to do?" And he said, "Well," I said, "Well, after Yorkshire Rippers, I'm going to do a book about the miners' strike." And John's dad was from Barnsley, but had joined the police and had been like in the Met, but his grandfather and his like uncles and family were involved in the strike. And we started talking. We were at lunch, and we started talking about the strike, and we must have talked for hours and hours about it, just in this pub in London. And we were having a few drinks, and we were getting really emotional about it. And then at the end, because I had to go to King's Cross to get the train back, John said to me, "You should write that. That's the book you should write now, not the Yorkshire Rippers." And I was like, yeah, that's the book I should write. So I get on the train back to King's Cross, and I got home, and I'd had a few drinks. And I remember waking up the next morning thinking, like, bloody hell, or worse to that effect. I've got like, what am I going to do? I've got 6 or 7 days of my holiday left, and I've got to research, like, so I quickly, like, called mates and friends, and so those 6 days I did really hectic interviews and like stupidly ill prepared interviews with like, I had friends who like been on strike and some like different people, and so luckily I was able to do those, and then also make some calls from Japan and like later, and make, and also I think like, I was thinking I didn't have the internet, we did, and so some emails and like details and things like that, because it's interesting. Before we started recording, you were talking about, I think you said that was it one of your relatives, they took a break from a pit and then they didn't want to go back. Was that what you said?
My mum's dad. He left the pit and never wanted to go back.
Yeah, no. So actually, one of the lads, I like he was a lad at the time, but like now one of the men, he'd been on strike. He was on strike for the whole time, but when it came to going back, he just found like he'd lost it. He couldn't go back. He'd like lost. He just didn't want to go back underground, and he just quit. And he retrained as a teacher. And he said it. So it was. He said it was the best and worst thing that ever happened to me was the strike. It was like it. Like the loss of the strike was devastating. Losing the strike was devastating, but it actually changed his life. But he realised he just couldn't go back down underground after being. Yeah. So there was. I mean, they were really those were really important conversations and contacts that I made. I remember it was like in the back of the book. There's all the there's all the like the non-fiction accounts that or it should be. I think it is. Yeah. There's all the sources and acknowledgements at the back of the book and I mean they were like key to it as well as the local newspapers. I did a book of. Later on, I did a book of photographs. I did an introduction to a book of photographs called No Redemption. I don't know if you've seen that, by the photographer Keith Patterson. And actually, that was how in an ideal world, that was how I would have done the proper if I could have researched GB84. Because with that, Keith Patterson was a photographer who, for the strike, was in for the whole year, was in Easington in County Durham. And he took all these photos and he never did anything with them. And then when he retired, he decided he'd like self-publish the book. And he got in contact after he read GB84 and asked if I would do an introduction. And all I wanted to do, though, was to try to meet with him, the people in the photographs, and to talk about it. And that's what we did. And and so actually the introduction is just basically dialogues with the people involved, and I thought that was and we're actually bringing out a new edition of that book actually, and like an updated edition of that book. But that was, I only bring that up because we were able to spend days talking to people and recording them, and it would just get to know them in a much better way. But I was lucky because it was while I was back for a long period. Yeah.
No, that sounds fantastic, and it's really interesting what you said about people not wanting to go back after the strike. People who've been on strike for the whole year, because I have spoke to some people who, they were on strike and then they like you said, they just couldn't, they didn't want to work in the mining industry anymore, and they changed careers. So it's interesting. It's not always as black and white a story as you think. There's a lot of people have different experiences of it.
Yeah,
and that sort of leads me on to a bit about your new book Munich. And you've written a lot about football and the mid-20th century Britain, but you said that MUNICHS was influenced by the impact the 1958 Munich air disaster had on your father.
Yeah.
What sparked sort of your interest in football and that sort of period of British history more broadly?
Well, actually, my interest in football was really, I think my dad and actually my own son are fanatical, really, like in a way that I'm not really, But I think, because I grew up when my dad was so interested in sport and things that but he also I was lucky because he liked reading about sport. And so there were a lot of books about sport in the house. And that's how I remember I had a book about Munich when I was about 6 or 7 or whatever. He had a book about Munich, the disaster, and he was then started telling me about it. And I mean, his really, the interest in football is through my father. And really, the damn. I remember the football books are actually, each of them really in a way sparked by the Huddersfield Town connection, because my grandfather, my dad, and I all sport Huddersfield. The Dams United, my dad took me, the very first football game he took me to was the Leeds Huddersfield pre-season friendly, which was Brian Clough's first game in charge. So that really, and then 44 days later, Brian Clough had been sacked, and that then became a kind of conversation, between us about what went on and the kind of mystery of those 44 days. And then Red or Dead, Bill Shankly was at Huddersfield before he went to Liverpool, so that was the trigger there. And also Bill Shankly, in a way, that was an attempt also to write about a kind of socialist who I see as a socialist saint, really. So that came from that. And then MUNICHS, as you say, was like my dad and my granddad saw 1953. Busby brought the first kind of iteration of the Busby Babes to Huddersfield. And my dad saw Duncan Edwards play, and my dad was 16 and Duncan Edwards was 17. And it had a huge impact on my dad. And then he was at, after a lot of different twists and turns, he ends up at Teacher Training College in London. And he was at the last game that Manchester United played against Arsenal before the crash. And then it just had a huge impact on him. And I thought really that, I think that, most people who follow football are aware of what the Munich air disaster was, and like know that some Manchester United footballers were killed and so forth, but probably don't know much more than that, unless they support Manchester United. And I really wanted to kind of re-establish it as a national tragedy, but particularly like a working class tragedy, because the similarity with the miners' strike is that these are like, people know like the Munich air disaster, the miners' strike, but I don't think they know the details really. And I think that this kind of working class history, like particularly like 20th century working class history, just seems to be forgotten. And it's I think there don't seem to be many books written about this, like novels anyway, written about these kind of periods and these kind of stories. And I think it's just whether it's in a positive light like Bill Shankly, or whether it's something like terrible like the miners' strike. But obviously the miners' strike, there were many positive things that came out of that as well. And with Munich, it is about the tragedy, but it's also about how Jimmy Murphy, the assistant manager, and the staff and the supporters and so forth kept Manchester United going. And I think I would say that there's inspiration in some of these stories as well. I hope.
And a bit of a left turn, because I'm going to return to ask you a little bit more about MUNICHS just before we wrap up. But how did you feel returning to Wakefield? Because I know you lived in Tokyo for a long period of time, and then you returned briefly, didn't you, for a few years, and then went back to Tokyo. How did you feel?
Well, so I came back from 2009 to 2011. We were living in Ossett, and it was really, good to be back. But I just found it, and I did a lot of, like, one of the things that I miss being in Tokyo is doing events, basically, because apart from friends and family, obviously, but I miss doing events because it's like meeting people and talking with people. And one of the best things that happened there was with this No Redemption book, we did quite a lot of events with Unite, the union. We did an event at the mining museum, the National Mining Museum in Wakefield. We did one at the Working Class History Museum in Salford. And then we did like the Durham, we did Durham, and, it was just, and we did Easington as well, obviously. And went around doing these events and just being in rooms with like people talking about the strike, and then a similar thing happened with doing the events about Munich. So people just come along, and and they don't have to be. It wasn't Manchester. Like it was in Durham, it was in like Holmfirth, it was in like Belfast, Dublin. People were just talking about these. I think people want that, like the books, I think, give people an opportunity to share their own experiences. And as I say, these are things and that was the best thing about being back for those 2 years. But it meant, unfortunately, that I didn't. I suppose the advantage I have in Tokyo is that I have more kind of time then to write the books. So it's getting that balance. But now I'm trying to spend more time back in Yorkshire. Particularly as my mum the age my mum is in.
And sort of leading on from that, what advice would you give to aspiring writers in Wakefield today, or more broadly, anywhere in the world? Is there anything that you've learned from your own journey?
I was going to say move, because that's what I did. I don't mean that. I was just being just like facetious. What advice would I get? I know it sounds like a really flippant thing to say, but the main advice I would always give is don't give up and keep writing, because I started seriously trying to get published when I was like about 21, but I didn't end up being published until I was 32. And so, I got rejected by every publisher honestly got rejected by every publisher in the country, and sometimes quite aggressively, like, don't ever send us any stuff again type kind of things, So I think the thing to do is just to never is to not give, and this goes for everything really, but never give up and just keep writing and try to write every day. A little, just set some time aside and write every day. And if you get, the other thing I found, which has always helped me, is if you get like kind of writer's block, or there's nothing that you coming to you, then actually copy out a page of a book that you like in longhand and then mess around with it. So if you copy out a page and it's written in the first person, change it into the third person. If it's written in the present tense, change it into the past. Just mess around with it, and it'll give you some ideas. It always gives you some ideas. So that would be the advice I would.
Thank you. No, I think I'll resonate with a lot of people. I think I probably should write more myself, but I've started doing that. Same as with you, I've moved to Spain to teach, and I've started doing more writing, doing more things with the podcast. I think you get the time.
Distance helps, to be honest with you. I do think it. I do. for me, it certainly helped. Particularly if you're writing. The thing for me with like living in Tokyo, in terms of like the distance, it meant that trying to get back the language of like the 70s or during the strike, it was like I wasn't as distracted by the contemporary British, British. The language in England changes all the time. Slang comes in, and you start to, it's like, for example, you're away for 2 years, and then you come back, and everybody's suddenly calling everybody mate. It just didn't happen before. It's just people think it did, but it didn't. It's just you notice these things, and it's just trying to get back that kind of like the distance can allow you to get the perspective and to bring back the times you want. Yeah.
And finally, obviously, congratulations on the success of MUNICHS. You have spoken a little bit about the book earlier in the interview, but I think one of the things I read in the previous interview you did is that a big part of the novel is, I don't know, tragedy chantings and the impact that has on people, and that's something obviously that still happens today. And you can apply that to things like the miners' strike too, where people used inflammatory language to wind up people on the line. So, what do you think? Why do you think, or what do you think is the importance of its message today, of MUNICHS and of that, the impact of that tragedy chanting and things?
I think that kind of, I mean, maybe I'm being a bit too naive and optimistic, but I think these kind of like that kind of language and the tragedy chanting and so forth, it's born out of ignorance and not knowing your history. Because if you knew, at the time, not everybody, but at the time, most people, rallied behind Manchester United and the supporters and so forth, and were sympathetic, and were not everybody though, and it's never going to be everybody. And and it's the same with I've heard we've seen that kind of thing, like you saw it on the similar kind of things on picket lines when like policemen would wave their money at the striking miners and different things, and it's just born out of like ignorance and a lack of empathy. And I think that like if there's one thing that maybe novels and podcasts like this and like dramas or like songs or whatever, if one thing that they can do is practically just kind of help people like to learn the history, to educate people on the history, and to kind of make people understand what other people went through, and you'd hope then that people would be kinder to each other, really, and more sympathy, and to have to show more empathy and sympathy, you would hope, really.
David's latest novel, MUNICHS, is out now with Faber and Faber and has been featured in the Sunday Times Best Books of 2024. To learn more about the miners' strike and how it impacted communities in Wakefield and across the Yorkshire coalfield, please subscribe to the Culture of Coal podcast. Thank you for listening, and I hope you can join me as the journey continues.